Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, a view from the viewfinder, how I nailed that shot, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader, Aditya Panda. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, Rob. Hello, everyone. Good to see you again. Our photography webinars have been getting really popular, so I've decided to start and do more of them. And before I start today's webinar, let me introduce myself again. My name is Aditya Panda, and I have been leading Natural Habitat Adventures expeditions in India since 2016. I lead expeditions that primarily take us to our large mammal habitats in central India, northeastern India, and northwestern India. And the Grand India Wildlife Adventure and India Tiger Quest are, two trips that I lead, as well as the photo pro version of India Tiger Quest. I also do spend as much time as I can in conservation in tiger and elephant landscapes of eastern central India. On today's webinar, most of the pictures that I'm going to show you are going to be from these two trips that I've listed here in my introduction, but there are going to be some pictures that are going to be from other places. But these are all species. All these pictures are going to be of species that you can expect to see while on safari in India with Natural Habitat Adventures. So every time I present on Daily Dose of Nature, I get questions about the pictures that I use in my slides. There's a lot of curiosity about what gear I use, how I take these pictures, what conditions they're taken under, etc., etc. And I thought that it would be fun to do a webinar to go through some of my favorite pictures from my own collection and just talk about the circumstances they were taken in, the camera settings and other technical details, of course, but also how I ended up seeing what I photographed and how I ended up transforming those sightings into pictures. So I've put together about 30 odd pictures, and I'm going to tell you the story behind each of them. But before that, I'm going to turn my webcam off. I'll turn it right back on when we get to the Q&A. I'm turning it off because I want the pictures to have as much real estate on your screens as possible. So one of the first pictures that I want to show you is actually a picture, probably the first picture that I've ever taken that, when I came back home and looked at it on a screen, I decided that, wow, this picture probably needs to be on a wall. This was back in 2009, and I was in a reserve called the Simlipal Tiger Reserve, which isn't very well known in safari circuits or tourism circuits because of various issues, including the fact that there isn't much tourism there, and the reserve suffers a lot of conservation challenges. And there is good presence of wildlife only in the core area of the reserve, which is out of bounds to visitors. I happen to be enjoying a lovely week there, helping the forest department and the park management with a tiger estimation exercise. And I got the chance to be on foot in this magical place for a week. And I spent that entire week in what we call an anti-poaching camp or anti-poaching hut, which is, a very rudimentary cabin in the woods in the middle of nowhere with no running water, with no toilets, nothing of that sort. And I spent my week there with with a forest guard and a couple of forest watchers who share that anti-poaching camp within. And this was in January 2009. And as we will see in the technical details of this picture later, the equipment that I used would be, practically rudimentary in today's day and date. But so I was there as the sun was setting that January evening, and mist had started to rise. Temperatures get pretty low there in that time of the year. We are still in the tropics, but because of the elevation, the temperatures in winter go down to freezing or below. And so I was there this evening waiting for animals to start arriving at a salt lick in the middle of this massive meadow that I was overlooking. And then on the horizon, I saw this, this huge two domes here just above the grass line. As you can see, the land sort of dips below, just where the horizon is, not the horizon, but just where the grass ends in this picture. And as that dome grew bigger and bigger and, appearing above the grass line, there manifested this absolutely handsome bull elephant, beautiful tusker. And, light was falling. And the equipment I had then, this was 2009, so you couldn't really shoot at the crazy ISO speeds that you can today. And I had set my camera at ISO 400, and I kept my fingers crossed that I'd get decent results. And I managed to get this tusker, framed against that beautiful bluish misty background and the beautiful yellow grass around it. And the animal was walking at its regal best. It was the most magnificent bull elephant I had seen, and the swagger with which he was walking was just mind-blowing. And I managed to get this picture where, as you can see, he's got the tip of his trunk sort of turned towards where I am. While he walked, his demeanor never changed. He was full of confidence, but as he walked, he was just taking in a little bit of scent from my direction, just making sure that I wasn't any threat or any nuisance to him. And that's how I got this picture. And as you can see, I've framed it using the good old absolutely reliable rule of thirds method. And the equipment I used was, believe it or not, a Pentax K10D DSLR, which had, the astronomical figure of 10 megapixels. I think even webcams have more than that these days. But that was a lot then. And I used a 300 millimeter f4 prime lens, which was the Pentax DA Star 300 millimeter f4 prime lens, which is a brilliant piece of optics. I no longer use Pentax now, but I am still too attached to my gear, and I've preserved this lens. I used to shoot Pentax for well over 10 years. But because of the situation there, the distance between me and the elephant, I decided to use a 1.7x teleconverter, which gave me an extended reach and effectively 510 millimeters. But it also dropped my aperture down to 6.8. And low light, teleconverter, low aperture, narrow aperture, not enough ISO, handheld. And I was really crossing my fingers that I'd get a steady, sharp shot. And as luck would have it, as I fired off the Pentax K10D at its top speed of 3 frames per second, which is absolutely nothing compared to the 20 frames or more per second that you get with today's DSLRs, I managed to get this keeper. The shutter speed, as you can see, was only 125th of a second, which is at that focal length difficult to handhold, but I still managed to get a keeper. Another of my favorite pictures is of this beautiful mother elephant and her calf at Corbett Tiger Reserve. Again, a fabulous part of the country, a fabulous part of the world. Foothills of the Himalaya, some of the finest tiger and elephant country anywhere, and named after the legendary Jim Corbett, who is such a famous author and who, in his day, in the 1940s, 30s and 40s, used to hunt in this area. Of course, he was one of the best known hunter turned conservationists who hung his rifles and advocated for conservation a lot. This particular picture was taken again late in the afternoon using the same equipment as the picture before this, same outdated equipment, and there is a large reservoir there where a lot of elephants gather every afternoon in the peak of summer, when the hill streams and other natural water bodies dry up, and you get close to 100 elephant, if not more sometimes. And it was just pure bliss, just picking your elephant and photographing. And this particular mother and calf, I must have shot probably 50 or 100 frames of them, but this particular frame, I really loved it because they're almost like mirror images of each other. The calf is much smaller, but you see the way the trunk is carried, the way the tails are in the air, and the way both mom and daughter are trotting. It was just beautiful, and the light of the setting sun added a nice pinkish golden hue, which I really liked. This picture was shot at ISO 100, which gave me, brilliant quality. But the shutter speed was only 1/100th of a second, which I think worked out to be really good, because if you notice, if you look at this picture closely, you can see that while the eye of the elephant and her body are in absolute sharp focus and suffer no motion blur, sometimes motion blur can actually work to your advantage. Just look at how that raised front right foot and that little bit of motion blur in the trunk, both in the mother and the baby, gives you that, it really makes the motion, the speed of the animal stand out. It gives you that feel that this animal is running. If I would have used, say, 1/1000th of a second, a really fast shutter speed of something like that, and absolutely frozen this image, I don't think it would be as interesting. So sometimes motion blur does work in your advantage, so use it to your advantage. As a great photographer once said, as long as the eye of the animal is in focus, everything else is in focus enough, and everything else is sharp enough. Sometimes, even that rule doesn't need to apply. The most important rule in photography, especially wildlife photography, is that there are no rules. There are only guidelines. This is one of my all-time favorite pictures. This was on a visit to Kaziranga National Park, where we go on the Grand India Wildlife Adventure. Kaziranga I've often described as the Ngorongoro crater of Asia, or the Serengeti of Asia, whatever you might wish to call it, because nowhere else outside of the African continent, probably nowhere else outside of East Africa, do you get to see such a large congregation and such variety of large mammals in the world as you probably get to see in the Kaziranga National Park and Tiger Reserve. And I was there one evening at a watchtower overlooking this large beel, as they're called locally, large sort of oxbow lake. And we saw a herd of elephants start to appear. And, as the herd approached the water, I was trying to look for an interesting enough frame. As you can see, the herd was quite far away, but you don't always have to zoom in. You can, make some brilliant images if you manage to showcase the animal or your subject in the landscape that it exists. So as the elephant herd approached the water, I was getting ready, expecting them to swim across. But the matriarch who was leading the herd first stopped at the water and started to drink. And the rest of the herd was lined up beautifully around her, behind her. And again, light of the setting sun, beautiful golden hues. And in the background, you have those expansive grassland, and then a layer of woodland, and then a layer of hill that you can barely see in the background of this picture. So several layers to this picture. And of course, there were a line of silk cotton trees with their brilliant scarlet red flowers, and they only flower for maybe 3 months a year between February and April. And that's one of the best times. That's one of my favorite times to be at Kaziranga, because they add so much to the beauty of the park and so much to the beauty of the pictures that you can make there. On this trip, my Pentax gear was out of service, so I had actually hired some equipment from Calcutta, and I had shot this with a Canon 7D and a 300 millimeter f4 prime lens. And I managed to get, despite the light going down, I managed to shoot at ISO 100 and got a decent shutter speed of 1/800 of a second. Now this was, I think this was 2014, if I'm correct. 2014, yes. And 8 years later, exactly at the same spot, on my last Grand India Wildlife Adventure, I got to photograph this brilliant tusker again in the same water body, except that this time we were on a morning game drive, and there was a lot of clouds building up, and it was going to rain any moment. And then it started to drizzle, and we were near this water hole. There's a nice watchtower overlooking it, so we made straight for the watchtower to shelter ourselves as the rain started to pound. And we ran up the watchtower and decided to enjoy, make the best of bad weather on a game drive. So there was no elephant then when we arrived. And as we were just taking in the landscape around us, sheltering ourselves from the rain, we start to see this elephant appear in the tall grass to our right. And it seemed to be headed towards the water. So, some photographers in our group and I raced downstairs again, 3 floors of the watchtower. We raced down to the water and waited for the elephant to arrive. And that's one of the few places where you can actually be on foot and be able to photograph animals. So we actually lay down on the ground to get as low a perspective as we could. And this elephant walked right into the water. it was a shallow patch, so it looked as if he was walking on the water. And in that beautiful muted light of a cloudy, rainy day, and the nice drizzle, muted light works really well. You don't always have to have bright sunshine to get good light on your subject. Muted light works really well because then there is no hard contrast. There are no dark shadows and blown out highlights that you can have in bright sunlight. So we made the best of that, and gear these days is weatherproof, and a little bit of drizzle certainly doesn't hurt most camera gear these days. And even if it does, you can always put a lot of rain covers that are available, online or at a camera store near you on your gear, and continue to shoot in the rain rather than put your gear in. And I took several pictures of this elephant, but this one was my favorite. Look at how symmetrically he's standing and how he almost looks as if he's walking on the water. This was shot with my present workhorse, the Nikon D500, which is a brilliant wildlife camera. It's super fast, and it's a really good workhorse. Acquires focus lightning fast, can shoot off 10 frames per second, which is, I think, more than what I need. And the lens I used for this was also my go-to safari lens, the Nikon 200 to 500 5.6, which is a brilliant lens to be with on safari because it gives you the perfect range that you need for both large mammals as well as birds. And it's a really versatile lens, and a really sharp one at that. This was shot at 1/500th of a second and f5.6, which is the widest that my lens could go, and at ISO 800. You will notice as I show you my pictures and the EXIF details that I tend to shoot mostly wide open, and that works for me with wildlife. At the same park, again back in 2014, I shot this rhino early in the morning. Beautiful mist rising in the background. Mist, golden light, muted light. These are all such beautiful things to have in your picture. It adds so much character to your picture. And this rhino, great one-horned rhinoceros, was walking through the grasslands, and the mist provided the perfect backdrop. And you can see how subtle and gentle the light on the rhino is. There are no harsh shadows as such, and the light is from it lights up the back of the animal mostly. I would have liked some more light on the face maybe, but it still turned out to be a picture that I am quite happy with. Shot again with the Canon EOS 7D with the 300 f4 prime. This was shot at a higher ISO of 1000 and a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. f4, of course, the widest aperture that I could afford on that lens, allowed me to get the beautiful blurred background. If you shoot wide open, it really helps you get those beautifully blurred backgrounds. We often overlook monkeys and deer and animals that are rather common in our forests and that we see all around us all the time. But in our pursuit of big game and elephants and tigers and leopards, we often forget or overlook the beautiful photo opportunities that these more common animals often provide. So this was after mid-morning game drives, breakfast, or bush breakfast as we call it, and winter morning, Kanha Tiger Reserve. And Kanha winters are spectacular. They're beautiful. There is always beautiful mist, the bluest of skies, clear, absolutely cloud-free blue skies. In the peak of winter, you might get some nice frost on the grasslands as well, and lovely golden light. And this bunch of langur monkeys was sunning themselves, warming up after a cold night. And I just loved how the shafts of light that filtered through the canopy of the sal forest looked in the background, and how they lit up the fur of the langur almost like a halo around them. And that's when we stopped to take a few pictures of them, and this is one of my favorites. Now, to talk about the equipment that I took this with, this is what I call my Plan C equipment. It is what I use when my main gear is out of service. My secondary gear is also out of service or unavailable for some reason. And that is when I resort to my trusty old, probably 30 years, 35-year-old Pentax M200mm f4 lens. It is like a brick. It was probably built in the 1980s. Absolutely manual, but beautiful piece of glass. And I keep that on my Pentax K10D, which I still have lying in a cupboard. And that's all I had that morning. So that's all I used. So as I often say, and as many photographers will often tell you, the best camera that you have on safari is the one with you, the one you're carrying, because that's the best you can use. So just make the best use of it. And the lens has absolutely no electronic communications with the DSLR, because it's got absolutely no electronics on it. It's a lens from the era of film SLR cameras. But with Pentax, you can use every Pentax lens ever made on a modern Pentax DSLR. So I took advantage of that. I had bought this lens on eBay probably for $100 or something like that. And I shot this at ISO 200, shutter speed of 1/640th of a second at f4. This was an amazing sighting. You can't really, you probably can't see the thrill behind this image, and you certainly can't hear it the way I did that morning. That morning, again at Kanha Tiger Reserve, again winter morning, beautiful mist, and we had just entered the park. And as we came out into an open grassland with a lot of large water bodies in it, we heard, an absolute, the jungle was just going alive with alarm calls. First by swamp deer or barasinga, then spotted deer, then sambar deer, barking deer as well, even langur in the trees. They were all, it was a crescendo. They were all just going full blast on alarm calls. And we stopped hoping to find a tiger. And, then we see this boar that was in the grass become absolutely alert and raise his head and start listening to the alarm calls, also expecting a tiger and making sure that it gets away from the tiger. No tiger appeared that morning, but this gaur on full alert, appearing out of the mist was a beautiful picture. And this again with the D500 and quick 200 to 500. I used an ISO of 1600 because I thought the mist might be cutting out a lot of light, but I needn't have bothered bumping it up to all the way to 1600. I could have used maybe 400 because the camera chose a shutter speed of 6400 which which was good, but I could have definitely done with much lesser. Now this Samba stag in Kana is actually looking at a tiger as I took this picture. Not at a tiger, but a tigress with 3 cubs who were to our left. They were just sitting there in the open grassland, the cubs playing around with the mother. And I had taken plenty of pictures of them, and then turned and looked right. And there was this stunning sambar stag looking up in full alert at the tiger with 2 hinds and a second stag in the background. So again, it was a cloudy morning. What looks like mist on a winter morning was actually, I think it was a late February morning or an early March morning, but it was a cloudy, overcast morning, and that gave this beautiful bluish, misty tinge. There's a funny story behind this picture. That morning, when we came upon that sighting, I actually realized that I had got everything I needed, all my gear, except that I had forgotten my battery, which I had left on charge in my room back at the lodge. So one of our guests in the Jeep was kind enough to lend me his backup body, which was a Nikon D5300, which I again used on my lens and the 200-500, and managed to get this picture. ISO 800 and 1/800th of a second. Sorry, the aperture was 5.6, not f4. That's a typo by me. A lot of times in India, while on safari, you will come across the sight of peacocks displaying, and everybody every second person in the world has pictures of peacocks displaying. But the way to make to make a very routine sight or a routine composition better or different is to try and compose it differently, to not try and get the entire bird, but in this case I chose to zoom in on the face of the bird and fill the frame out completely with that dazzling tail of it, the beautiful tail feathers, the feathers on the back of the bird, and the bird's face with its beautiful crest. And if you zoom in, it looks more like something someone painted or embroidered rather than something out of a jungle. So sometimes, if you zoom in or zoom out, you get a different perspective, and try to not get the same routine perspective that everybody gets of most animals, and you'll find a picture that stands out from the crowd. This again with the T500 and 200-500. Again, f5.6, not f4. ISO 1600 and 6400th of a second. Once again at Kanha Tiger Reserve, we were waiting. There wasn't much activity that morning, so we just waited next to a troop of langur monkeys, and there was this monkey who was really close to us, close enough that it was probably not possible for me to get a picture of the entire animal. But why get a picture of the entire animal when it is so close to you, and you can get, and again, it was at eye level, it was at the same level as me, and I chose to zoom in on the face of the animal and try and get some real proper portrait. And that's exactly what I did, and got some brilliant detail of the eyes and the fur on the eyebrow, And that's when I realized, again, my apologies for the typo, where with the 200 to 500 f5.6, I should have mentioned f5.6 and not f4. So you might see that a few more times. This was at the 500 millimeter end of the lens, ISO 400, and only 1/50th of a second shutter speed. But sometimes I try to shoot at the lowest possible shutter speed I can without getting motion blur, and at the lowest possible ISO I can. That is after I follow a procedure called ISO insurance, where I start by shooting with a higher ISO and progressively bring it down to see how far I can pull it. And with this, I managed to pull it down all the way to 1/50th of a second and still get a sharp picture. But as I was shooting this monkey, I realized that, why just look at the face of the animal? It was sitting there, and again I zoomed in on the hands and feet of the animal. He was sitting there with his fingers on his feet, like a person would sit lounging in their drawing room on a couch or something. And as I zoomed in, I just loved the detail of the fingers, the fingernails, and the feet. They really brought out the human element of the animal, and how it sort of reminded how these monkeys aren't all that far away from us biologically speaking, and how their fingers and fingernails are so similar to what we have. Again, this was even slower at 1/25th of a second. One of my favorite elephant images, as we left Kaziranga National Park one day on our way to the airport at the end of a Grand India Wildlife Adventure. Outside the national park, next to the road, in an area adjoining the national park, we saw this beautiful tusker feeding by the roadside on aquatic plants. And since we were on a public road, all of us got down from the car. I walked our group to a place that was close enough yet safe enough, and we got down to taking some last-minute pictures. Well, we had to do a lot of unpacking to get the cameras out because we were on our way to the airport and we were packed for flying. But I don't think anybody complained. And this was when I decided that a 200 to 500 can be limiting sometimes when the animal is too close. And I managed to get this at the 200 millimeter end of the lens, but I could have done with a slightly wider lens. And after that trip, I bought 70 to 200 2.8, which I will show you the results of later in today's webinar. When an animal is behind foliage, behind a lot of leaves, a lot of people have difficulty focusing because the camera focuses on everything else, every leaf, every twig, every branch except the animal. Some practiced use of moving your focus points around on the camera, or overriding with manual focus can help you overcome that. And that's how I got this picture of this beautiful tigress sleeping, just lying down, behind thick foliage, but looking at us through it. And it was a brilliant sighting at Kana Tiger Reserve, and a very special sighting because this was actually the third tiger that my wife had seen, and the first tiger that she had spotted herself. So very special picture for us, but also a picture that teaches you how you can You need to know your camera well enough to be able to move around those focus points and have them where you want, and also to practice manual focus override, to be able to get things in control when the camera is going all crazy over leaves and branches and twigs. It was late in the evening, so ISO 6400, and again slow shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. Tigers, like all cats, will often scratch trees and their favorite marking sites. They have their scratching posts, and this particular tigress had one on a dead tree that was lying on the ground. So usually a tiger will stand up against a tree and start breaking it, but this one, MB3 from Kana Tiger Reserve, uh, chose to get on this dead tree and started scratching. And as she scratched, there was this look of ecstasy on her face as she closed her eyes, and her tail was up like that, and she almost looked like one of those scorpion poses of a yoga practitioner. So I was telling you about the 70 to 200 lens that I bought after that elephant picture. This was one of the first pictures I got with the lens, and it's an absolute must-have in every safari photographer's bag. It's a brilliant lens, lets you get really wide, and we will see some more pictures from it. With really beautiful bokeh, which is the blurred out background, and a lot of photographers often refer to it as the elephant lens or the big cat lens because they're fabulous for photographing these animals. This tiger was far from the reach of a 70 to 200 lens. This was in Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve, and the tiger was far away, walking in tall grass. And with the naked eyes, you couldn't get a good look at it. With binoculars, he looked beautiful. But I decided to take a picture of, frame it in a way that I can show the camouflage that the tiger has evolved to have to walk in sunlight and shadow through tall grass and dappled sunlight of the jungle. And the picture turned out quite nice. There was lovely sunlight coming from the east. The tiger was walking probably east northeast, so lovely face lighting, and it was pretty nice how he merged into the grass and how his stripes and the orange and black sort of mimic the grass. This was at 480 millimeter, ISO 1600 in the morning again, 1/250th of a second. Everybody gets long lens pictures, a long lens perspective of most wildlife. That's what most wildlife photographers tend to do. But some of the best compositions come when you go wide and you go close. So that's something I've been increasingly challenging myself to do these days. Instead of going long, I've been trying to go wide, usually in the focal length of a portrait lens that you would use with humans, say 35 millimeter to a range of maybe 70 or 85 millimeter. And I'm trying to get closer. And this tiger in Ranthambore Tiger Reserve gave me just that opportunity. He was walking really close to our jeep, and I lowered my camera below the side of the jeep to get as low as possible. And at 70 millimeter and a wide open aperture of f2.8, I managed to get this perspective of this beautiful tiger. At the same sort of distance from the animal and the same eye level view, I zoomed in just for change, and at 200 millimeter I got a close-up of his face and brilliant bokeh or bokeh, however you pronounce it. beautiful, blurry, buttery smooth background. Sometimes you make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes come out really well. I was so excited seeing this tiger in Kaziranga, because Kaziranga is a place where you don't often see tigers, even though there is a really high density of them there. I was so excited to see, because the build up to this tiger sighting was amazing. We had heard him roaring, and we could tell he was close, but we couldn't pinpoint exactly where he'd come out. And Kaziranga tigers tend to be a little shy of jeeps. They don't come very close to jeeps like tigers in central India or Ranthambore do. And when this tiger appeared, he appeared for a very short time. And I was so excited that I shot off several frames without realizing that I had my lens stuck at the 200 millimeter range, 200 millimeter end of it, and had completely forgotten to zoom to 500 millimeters, which is what I would have preferred in this case, because I would have wanted a closer view of this tiger. But the way it has come out with the landscape of Kaziranga, so different from the first 50,000 pictures of tigers that you will see when you Google tiger, because it's from an unusual place in a very unusual setting. You're not seeing the typical yellow and greens of central India or Ranthambore, and just beautiful to see a tiger in a completely different kind of habitat in the moist evergreen forests of Kaziranga. And again, forgetting to zoom in allowed me to get this nice perspective of the animal in its landscape. And it's lovely how the trees sort of frame this image. And it's always nice to use natural elements to frame and compose your subject. Ranthambore once again, and we had this tiger next to the water. He was sitting in the water a while ago, and we got some good pictures. You might have seen those pictures in my past webinars. And then at one point, he got up and started walking towards this end of the pool. And at first, he stood and looked at his own reflection in the water. I was getting ready to actually photograph him drinking, but he clearly did not want to drink, and he just wanted to get over to the other side of the water. Tigers usually do not mind wading through. They love swimming in water. But this tiger at that moment decided to leap across that little 5 foot or 6 foot stretch of water. And thanks to the 70 to 200 millimeter lens, I managed to get a good picture of him. And there was a nice, so Ranthambore in summer is really dry and brown and yellow. But thanks to the water, there's a little bit of green around this to contrast. And even better, the flame of the forest tree flowers at that time of the year. This was early April, one of our first India Tiger Quest departures in 2022. And those flame of the forest flowers on the ground, by the edge of the water, really added some beautiful color to this image. Shot at only 98 mm, ISO 200 and 1/640th of a second. The same tiger later walked for a really long time on the road, and our Jeep had front row view because there was no other Jeep around us. We had this tiger entirely to ourselves. And again, I tried to get as low as I could despite being in a Jeep. And that always helps, if you try and get your camera down to the eye level of the animal. And wide open aperture, and flame of the forest flowers on the ground again, petals beautifully, contrasting with the earth. And I remember when I had posted this picture on my Instagram, I had captioned it something like, which is the real flame of the forest. I think the tiger is as much the flame of the forest as the flame of the forest trees, which has those brilliant orange flowers. This was at the 112 mm focal length. Again, 1/640th of a second, ISO 200 and wide open at f2.8. Again, the 70-200 does its magic. A beautiful young tigress against a setting sun at Panda Tiger Reserve. It's amazing the kind of dynamic range that cameras these days have. They allow you to capture. Hi Rob, sorry for the interruption. There was a power fluctuation and I lost my modem just restarted. So I hope you can hear me now.
We've got you loud and clear.
Perfect. So without further ado, I'd like to get to the Q&A because we are running out of time, as I see. And I would have liked to talk about a few more pictures, but I think we are going to need more webinars for that.
All right. Well, thank you. Now, before we start the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. And I also am grateful for everyone for hanging in there during our audio difficulties. So let's get to a couple of these questions. So we loved the opening picture of the elephants. It was beautiful. How much post-production was involved in those pictures?
Not much, Rob. My post-production philosophy is rather minimalistic, as I was explaining on my last webinar on the topic. It's limited just to correcting the horizon, framing the picture and making sure that the camera was straight. If it wasn't, I crop a little to make the picture straight. And I do a little bit of color and exposure correction, noise reduction if it is needed, and of course sharpening. That's more or less all the post-production that I do on any of my pictures.
So in photos of the larger animals, in general, do you have a specific focal point that you use?
It depends. You see, for a long time, I was shooting with prime lenses. So when I was shooting Pentax, I used to have a 300mm lens on one camera and a 90mm macro on the other camera. And both these lenses were all I had. So, I would use, I would frame whatever subject was there within the confines of these lenses, because you can't zoom in or zoom out on these lenses. But now I use zoom lenses once again. So I use 70-200mm lens and 200-500mm lens. 70-200 works great when you're close to animals, especially larger animals, and or if you want to take landscapes with animals in them. 200-500 is a great workhorse kind of range that you can play around with, depending on how close or far the animal is.
Is there one particular lens that you could use if you only wanted to bring one with you?
Well, the one particular lens that I would want to bring with me is one I do not have. It's going to take a lot of saving to get me one of those. That would be a 400mm 2.8 lens. But from my present gear and generally, I think a 70-200 2.8 would be the one lens in my camera bag if I could only have one lens.
Great, thank you for answering that. Now, are you shooting in manual mode only, or do you ever consider using any of the other modes and letting the camera set either the shutter speed or the ISO?
I mainly use the aperture priority mode, which is where I set the ISO of the camera and I set the I choose the aperture and I let the camera meter and choose a shutter speed. That's my main mode, aperture priority. But depending on the situation, I might switch to manual once in a while.
Are you ever considering going to a mirrorless camera?
Oh, absolutely. As soon as I can afford a system change, I am really keen on, as far as stills are concerned, still photography is concerned. DSLR still more than does the job. A camera like a Nikon D850 or the D500 or a D5 that are among the last DSLRs that Nikon manufactured. They do a great job if you're a purist still photographer. But mirrorless is the future, and these days, the kind of video ability that mirrorless cameras give you, it's just mind blowing. And when you're out on safari, a lot of photographers these days have also started doing a lot of video, and that's something that's exciting me as well. So I definitely love to switch to mirrorless, and I'm planning to do that soon.
Well, that's going to be the last question that we will have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and I look forward to doing more webinars with you, especially more photography webinars. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon with more Daily Dose of Nature webinars. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You could check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We are closed on Monday for the holiday, so our webinars will resume on Tuesday. Today's presentation was recorded, and you will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.